with that, let's start our first ever name behind the game. Very exciting initiative for NWA, and it's terrific to have Phil Yates from New Zealand on board. I hope you all had the opportunity to read Phil's bio. And the most exciting thing about it, he said he got AI to write it and it was mostly accurate. So perhaps we can start with the bio and say, well, what were the bits that were excitingly inaccurate, or you need to set the record straight?
Interesting. I don't actually remember it enough to be able to tell you that. But I did like the very laudatory tone it took. It described me in glowing terms, which I don't think I would have quite used such glowing terms if I was describing myself. I think one of the areas it may have got wrong was my involvement with Games Workshop. It's commonly sort of misinterpreted. I've never actually worked for Games Workshop or with Games Workshop. I did briefly have a contract with Warhammer Historical for Warhammer Panzer Battles back in the late 90s.
Okay.
But starting work for Battlefront sort of terminated that project, so it sort of disappeared.
So I suppose it's a good segue talking about prior to Battlefront and being involved in other things. So what got you into wargaming?
That's an excellent question. FX model soldiers, like 6 or 7, and at primary school they had a set of encyclopedias, like decent-sized set of encyclopedias on the First World War. Significantly pictorial, as might be appropriate for a primary school, but the reading age and material wasn't really primary school. But I do remember discovering them and then wondering, I think one of my great uncles had been at Passchendaele, and I only ever met him once, and Mum said, oh, you know, bring out your little models. I don't know what he thought of that, but I was only a young lad at primary school at the time, so I did, and learned that he was at Passchendaele and not much else. And anyway, I think it was after that I found the encyclopedias and opened them up, and the question was, why? It sort of, without, you know, I didn't read them from front to back, but it was like, why? Why did this happen? What actually happened and why? So that has sort of been my lifelong thing of, why did this happen? Not at the grand strategic level, but more at the tactical level, at the individual level. Why did people do this? Why did they put up with this? Why did they do the brave things they did? Why did they do the not so brave things they did? And the more I read, the more I discovered that a lot of what I was reading was inconsistent, and that most of the games that I discovered didn't really do a very good job of matching what I was reading. So I discovered wargaming at the same time as Star Trek came out. I remember the classroom I was in that year, but I don't remember, I think it was Standard 3. But it must have been 76 or 77. I'm not sure quite when Star Trek hit New Zealand. But Mum, I came home from school one day and Mum said, oh, I saw this thing, I heard it on the radio, saw it in the paper or something about wargaming. Would you like to go to the library and we'll see what they have? And so we went all the way into the library in town. And sure enough, they had some Donald Featherston and Charles Grant. And I became a member of the library and addicted to playing with toy soldiers in a more formal way. And yeah, haven't stopped.
Being back in New Zealand in the early 70s or the late 70s, and you're a kid, you got into wargaming. Was the wargaming scene like in New Zealand? Like, was it something you did by yourself? Did lots of people to be engaged?
No, Christchurch was fairly good. The Christchurch Wargame Society they met in a little scout hall. It was a good cycle from home, 20 minutes, half an hour away. But it was fine. And there'd normally be what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 games. As a kid, that seemed quite a lot. And so there'd be, a good dozen or more people. And then they had NatCon, Nikon, and SouthCon were all still running back then. And so I remember that. And there was one weekend they ran a what seemed to me huge game where they had 24 foot of tables by 4 foot wide, I think it probably was, of World War II games with the commanders in different rooms and messengers running backwards and forwards with orders and so forth. I was too junior and young to be invited to participate, but it was a fascinating spectacle as a young man. It was quite active right from before I was involved.
So starting off from being a spectator and then being a participant, obviously, with those games, did you ever have a go-to game that you started collecting and that's where you ended up going, or you just moved around in a bit of a butterfly?
World War II for me the whole way.
Yep.
So it was WRG 1925 to 1975, was it? 1950. WRG 1925 to 1950, the World War II game. In 1/300, initially in Airfix kits and so forth, but then quickly into 1/300th Heroics and Ross stuff. And that was most of my wargaming until university. At university, I sort of stopped and focused on my studies and things because it got a little more intense than, for a SWAT like me, a little more intense than it had been at high school. And I played the odd game of other things. There was a game being developed by the Christchurch guys, played that a few times. Mucked around with World War I aerial stuff. But it was World War II.
And so, as a young guy going into university and toying with other games, what makes the game compelling to you?
That it gets most of the things right. Sorry there. So I distinctly remember with my first tournament that I played, it was up in Wellington. So as a, 15-year-old, going from Christchurch to Wellington was a big deal. Got up to Wellington and they were playing, very strangely, a knockout tournament, which for a NatCon seems a bit foolish. So I got to play exactly one game and spent the rest of the weekend watching other people play games, which was a little disappointing and not an experience that I'd want anybody to repeat. But it quickly became obvious that there were quite a lot of problems with the WRG rules. I was a fan of British stuff, and the lethality of tigers in particular, and their inability of anything of my force to do anything about them apart from the occasional firefly, was, again, not the most exciting. I had some German stuff as well, but even my fast Cromwells couldn't close the gap fast enough to do anything. And infantry, I remember playing an infantry game that was just, and it was specifically, okay, we're going to try an infantry game. And it just didn't work in the slightest. I don't even remember exactly why. I still can sort of picture the game, but it didn't work. And that was like, okay, I really need to find something else or do something better, but there wasn't anything else really going. And that was the impetus to start really trying to write something better. Back then, of course, the only exposure to the world was the odd War Games magazine that you might find in a bookshop or that somebody might have subscribed to from overseas. So it very much was a, work it out for yourself type thing. And so after university, when I got to Wellington to work there, I bumped into a guy, and I was working in the Ministry of Ag and Fisheries at the time. And there's another guy in the building who was in the IT department who was also interested in World War II gaming. So together we wrote our first set of rules. And to be honest, I mean, I have a copy filed away somewhere, I hope, but that was because somebody gave me one long after, because, you don't think of keeping these sorts of things when you're young. It sort of worked, but it wasn't that great. But that was the first published set of rules when I was 20, and just been chipping away at trying to make sense of it since. And yeah.
When would that have been?
85, 86.
So just before third edition Warhammer came out and everything that happened around there.
Probably. At that time, I do remember seeing 40K for the first time at the Hut Club, and just thinking, looks interesting, but I've got enough on my plate without sort of getting into it. And then a little bit later at the Wellington Warlords, seeing people playing and just, figures are interesting, but the game just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I would much rather have played some of the more hard sci-fi stuff, but getting figures for that. And, as you probably are aware, most of you being in the age bracket to remember how expensive getting figures from the UK was and how impossible it was to get them from anywhere else, it wasn't something that I was going to get into. But I did sort of read all of the hard sci-fi rules I could find, but only played the occasional game. And actually, back in university in Canterbury, I did have a game of what was the Traveller tabletop game? Striker, yes, did have a game of Striker, which was also interesting because I and a guy who had a little more knowledge of Striker built forces, and of course it's completely from scratch, like what vehicles you're going to build and so forth. And I quickly discovered that his build and my build were incompatible in his favor, and the game didn't last long. But Striker was also an interesting game in that it could take 30 turns or so to pass orders, which was also there's something very, very wrong with this design here as well. It sort of made sense as a role-playing thing where a turn is just a unit of time measure as long as you're not playing turn by turn. But yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff in my early 20s where it was like, no, this isn't working. So yeah, and then I got married and stopped gaming for a while, as one does in that stage of life. And then a while later sort of started collecting again in, again, the FX artillery type stuff. Again, just a World War II interest. No particular game in mind at that point, just collecting figures and stuff. And then started mucking around with rules. And at that point, it was all very large-scale stuff. Although I also did a Crossfire related one that somebody mentioned, Red Poppy, White Feather, which was inspired by the description of Crossfire. I'd never read Crossfire, but it was like interesting. So no particular measurements, and turns are based on reaction. And I thought, that's an interesting idea. So went away and came up with my version of that, and then a large-scale divisional size game. And by that point, I was up in Wanganui, and we had monthly meetings up there. The club had become defunct. When I arrived, I went to the model railroad show sort of thing and managed to get a table in the corner and set up a game of Red Poppy White Feather and ran that, and managed to restart the club on the basis of that. We decided that we wouldn't actually have a venue or anything. We just once a month would go to somebody's house and they'd set up a game and we'd all participate, sort of thing. Anyway, after that had been going for a bit, my wife said, the games you're writing are boring. It's like, interesting. Okay. And so I took a step back, and Warhammer 40K 3rd edition had just come out. And I picked up a copy in the local gaming store and looked at it and thought, okay, let's have a look at that. So I bought a copy, took it home, had a read, and thought, okay, let's do World War II using this as a basis, just as another direction to go. And that was Warhammer Panzer Battles, which worked fairly well. It was very Warhammer, but it was a very different direction from what I'd been going. And it was like, okay, and sort of helped move my focus more into the user experience side, to use a modern term. I didn't think it was the greatest game, but it certainly played well. And so that's what I was doing when a friend of mine, Dallas, started collecting some Battlefront miniatures. And they were considerably smaller than the stuff I had. They looked quite good. But I was already sort of heavily invested in the 1/72nd scale stuff. And again, I'm not too easily distracted. I don't like more than 4 or 5 projects at once. I'm claiming for a wargamer that's not very easily distracted. And he said, "Oh, would you write a game for these for me?" And I was like, "I'm a little busy at the moment." And then I took Panzer Battles up to the Hamilton NatCon 3-day tournament event up here, and demonstrated that, trying to rekindle interest in the Second World War. The 2nd edition WRG rules had pretty much killed all interest in Second World War. Not that they weren't better than the first one, they were just sufficiently more complicated without adding any real value, that people just went off in other directions. So I was running demo games and getting quite a bit of interest, and the Battlefront stand was right beside me, and looked through and thought, wow, they do have quite a large collection. But yep, not really of much use to me at this point. And then Peter, the owner of Battlefront, said, "Oh, can we have a game?" It was like, sure, absolutely. Ran him through a game, and then I think it was the next day he came and said, "Would you like to do a game for us?" And I was like, it's a pretty big job and I've got enough on my plate at the moment. He said, "No, we'll pay you." And I was like, right. And no, he was fairly persistent, and we talked, and he said, "Look, tell you what, you bring your wife up to Auckland, I'll put you up in a nice hotel and we'll have a weekend and we'll talk about it." And I was like, okay. Long story short, by the end of the weekend, I asked my wife, "Can I have a sabbatical for a year? You've been doing your degree and so forth, and it's all cool. I mean, yep, our finances won't be as good at the end of the year as they are at the moment. We'll have to actually start taking out student loans to pay for your fees and things, but it's only a year, and I'd like to do it." So she was very generous and said yes. 24 years later, I'm still working for Battlefront. That was the start of Flames of War.
That's fascinating, Phil. And thanks for sharing that. It's great to know the history and the journey that you've taken in New Zealand, totally isolated from everything else. And you got to where you are. It is really quite inspirational. you mentioned a couple of things in the conversation around playability, fun, and at the same time, probably, when things are too much stat-based or bogged down, which is at the opposite end of the scale, how do you sort of position a game to make sense, I suppose, in terms of it plays well versus it's still accurate, which is one of the things that got you into this in the first place?
Okay. I'll go off on a little tangent and tell another little anecdote. The first job I had when I mentioned the Ministry of Ag and Fisheries, I was an operations researcher for them. And the guy who employed me and one of my classmates to start the operations research group in Ministry of Ag and Fisheries. And I was employed during the Muldoon government, the Think Big government, where the right of centre government had become about as left-wing as you could possibly imagine, with the most cosseted economy and blah, blah, blah. The election, or maybe he'd lost the election by the time I was employed, but still, by the time I got to Wellington, the government had changed and we had a Labour government that was distinctly laissez-faire and proceeded to demolish the unions and go much more into free market, which was an interesting twist for a while. But anyway, my boss wanted the other guy who was working with me to write a simulation of a meatworks, because he expected to have some work to do in meatworks. He then went off and left for MIT. And several years later, I was still there. It must have been nearly 2 years later. And sure enough, a meatworks job turned up down with Fortex in the South Island. They had a plant that had been designed for 24-hour operation. It was pretty brand new, and it was done at a time when there was a fair expectation that that would be something that would happen. They were running it on 2 shifts of 10 hours a day. So the guys would work 4 10-hour shifts, and then another lot would work 4 10-hour shifts. So they were running it, 70 hours a week, but they wanted to go back to go up to the 24-hour operation that they'd expected. Anyway, the problem was the chillers were all full, and they were already chock-a-block with the chillers. So how are they going to get twice as much stuff more than twice as much stuff through the chillers a day? I spent the whole week trying to get this massive simulation to work. Come Thursday night, 11 o'clock, I set it running again, and I set my alarm clock for 1 o'clock because it blew up after 2 hours every time. 1 o'clock, I woke up, went and had a look. It had blown up. I went back to bed. Woke up in the morning and thought, right, stuff this, it doesn't work. Called them up and said, I'm not going to be there till the afternoon, and spent the morning thinking. And then afternoon I went, okay, I think I have some ideas. I'll let you know on Monday. Went back to Wellington. And on Monday, I basically just used simple queuing theory. The shortest equation you can get. It was just time equals blah, blah, blah over blah, 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 blah times blah, blah, blah. And sure enough, it solved the problem. And that taught me that simulations are stupid. The whole butterfly effect. That basically, the shortest way between the input and the output is the best way. As long as the output matches the input, it doesn't matter how you get there. And the more detail you put in the middle is the more ways of it getting wrong. So the relevance to that, to Flames of War, for instance, is armor penetration. You could model armor penetration inside, or physically in the game, as some do, with big tables and all sorts of stuff. And if you're doing something like World of Tanks with a computer, yep, go for fancy armor simulations. But the facts are that basically this tank shooting at that tank has X chance of achieving a positive result, or at least for the shooting tank, or Y chance for choosing a positive result for the target tank. So the simple model is roll higher than X and it works. Now, of course, trying to work out what that X is not easy. But it turns out that you can model things like armor penetration on a couple of simple things. You need more than this. But if you know the caliber of a gun and the barrel length of a gun, you can make a very good estimate for any given tech level of the penetration of the gun. And likewise, things like slope of armor is generally overstated. You know, people think, oh, a Panther's got 120 millimeters of armor. No, it's got 80 millimeters of armor sloped at 60, 55 degrees or whatever. And that's not the same as 120 millimeters vertical, because 120 millimeters vertical can only get better. Whereas the Panther is almost as good as it can get, and anything goes worse, it will be worse. So the effect of sloped armor isn't as good as people think, and particularly with heavy shells. If you put a 6-inch shell into even a slow-moving 6-inch shell into a 40-millimeter sloped plate, the 40-millimeter plate is going to buckle. It may not permanently deform, but it's got a lot of energy, momentum to handle before it can sort of deflect the shot. Whereas if it's the equivalent of, say, 70 millimeters vertical, that's got a lot more resistance to deformation. So again, all that sort of thing. But you can make fairly good estimates with very, very simple maths. And so that's where Flames of War started in terms of its armor penetration. The maths have got a little more sophisticated, but not much more, more so. But the idea is, the answer to your question is, do a lot of maths behind the scenes and then present the answers, and only the answers, and only to the detail needed. So, you know, Flames of War, oh, it's not a simulation. No, it's not, but it'll produce very, very similar results to a simulation. If you use a complex simulation of this tank against this tank under a variety of circumstances that match the general thing you see on the table, medium to long range, both tanks in the open, you should get pretty much the same summation outcome as you get with Flames of War. So the goal was basically do a lot of research and mathematics and stuff behind the scenes, and then just find the simplest possible model that wasn't incompatible with it.
Oh, really? That's a great analogy. I used to work in a meatworks, by the way, so I can understand the challenges that you were facing down there. Okay. First edition of the book. So here with the others.
No, I can do you one better. What is it?
Oh, wonderful.
That was the first printed copy.
So unfortunately, the pages fell out. But my question is that you?
Looks like it, yep.
Very good. Very excited at the time. No. So one of the things that I enjoyed about reading the book, not just the rules, because it was fun to play the game, was the amount of research or the anecdotes in the books that retold the World War II story that helped bring the battles to life with the other information out there. So from what you've said, there's obviously your research mathematical bent around that side of the game's design. But then there's also bringing the book and the rules to life with the personal stories, the life of the infantryman or someone else, or as a result of what you where is that book? I went and bought that in New Zealand as a result of seeing it in Flames of War, and it's a terrific story as well. So how did you balance the research, mathematical, analytical side of what you did with the rules writing, but then also bringing the books to life with the other historical context?
Well, interesting enough, after working for the Ministry of Ag and Fisheries, I worked for Travers Morgan, who were an Australian-based transport consultancy. And I actually left them and became a storyteller briefly, oral storyteller. And then to get better at doing that, I started teaching people to use computers. So story has always been in my blood, so to speak. And that was an interesting experience. I love stories. I love telling stories. So telling history through stories or trying to make it accessible is also something that works for me. So yeah, communications was the other half of my, mathematics and communications, which come together well in the area, in that trying to understand what happened, translate it into a simple model, and then communicate that simple model to people in the form of a game is my thing. Yeah, I just find all the tales fascinating, and that's the source of a lot of the dissatisfaction with other games. It's like, okay, this guy said this, and that doesn't match. And a lot of the history is like, that's not really matching either. And so over the last, I don't know, while, I've got quite into Napoleonic period, and trying to understand that in the same way. It's like most of what is written is clearly bollocks. It just doesn't stand up when you really start looking at it, especially when you start looking at it from an international perspective, when you start looking at it from multiple sources, and things. And looking at it from earlier periods and through to later periods, you can't look at any period in isolation. You can't understand the Second World War without understanding the Napoleonic Wars, because you can't understand the First World War unless you understand the Napoleonic Wars. You can't understand the Second World War unless you understand the First World War, because you can't understand where things have come from and where they're going and why they're going that way. Like, you can't understand tanks without understanding what came before, and without understanding cavalry, and without understanding machine guns and so forth. You can't understand, any of these things, infantry tactics, without knowing where they've come from and where they're going. And if you only look at one period, you can easily come to some very strange conclusions. And you see that sometimes with historians who get too narrowly focused, and some of their conclusions and stuff are just like, no, absolutely no. Just look 20 years before or 20 years after, and it's clear that your statement is complete bollocks because. So, yeah, a wide understanding and interest is useful. And now I have no idea what started this question, so I'll shut up now.
I think it was really interesting. The Flames of War came out, and if you were to take your little spiral bound one, we're looking at, let's say you started that 25 years ago. And a quarter of a century on, the game has evolved, it's gone globally around there, it's had a number of iterations. How have you found that the journey? Has it been a roller coaster? Has it been nice and sequential? What has it given to you?
The biggest thing is actually a far better understanding of human nature and the human factors in games design. I was perhaps a little idealistic back then about the possibility of writing ivory tower stuff. Now my first consideration on any rule is very much, okay, how will people abuse this? How will people do things with this rule that aren't what I want them to do? I sort of view writing a set of gaming rules as programming people. One of my sort of things I studied was programming, and I have done a bit of that occasionally. And yeah, I'm writing a set of input instructions, and I want this behavior to come out at the other end. I want people to enjoy themselves, and I want them to play the game this way. And one of the sort of directions we went initially was from version 1 to version 2 is, okay, we weren't clear enough. Interesting. We will try and be a little more clear, and we will try and sort of fill a few of those holes that we didn't see. And yep, we can do better. And so we did. And version 2 also diversified into a lot of stuff. We added rules for, I don't know, minefields and night and reconnaissance, and you name it, it got added. So version 3 was the pinnacle of this direction. We stuck all of the bits we had added in and filled all the holes that had come up. And what I learned from that is that was a complete waste of time, because the people who created the holes in the first place simply misused the new stuff to find new holes. So version 4 went completely in the opposite direction. It said, fine, it makes no difference whether or not we try and make it work for the people who are going to try and misuse the rules. So what we need to do is focus on a set of rules that are easy to use for the players who are just playing the game. The others will abuse it no matter what we do. So any issues about like that, we'll just answer in the FAQ. And so that's been the approach for the last, nearly 5 years since version 4 came out, has been just to go, okay, we want the rules simple. And when people come up with stuff, we just say, no, you can't do that. Even if it says you can in the rules, if it breaks the rules, it's just like, no, you can't do that. New rule, not allowed to do that in the FAQ, because that's the simplest way of handling it, rather than making the rules yay thick instead.
So do you have a love-hate relationship with the tournament scene?
No, not really. I think that style of gamer is missing out on a lot in life. And some of them can be utterly infuriating, especially in the playtest team. But they're also extremely useful in helping to understand that direction of thinking and try and anticipate things that they're going to do and avoid them earlier. But yeah, it's just human nature. There are people who are going to do that. And I do try and keep my answers and direction in the casual side rather than the legal side, and try and make the answers, justify the answers either from the rule book. It's like, the rules say this, and sometimes I quote the rule book and I think, fine, that needs to change in the next version, but it's not thoroughly broken, so we'll just quote the rule book in the most favorable light I can and say, this is how you are supposed to interpret this. Sometimes it stretches things a little bit, and sometimes, as I said, it's like, no, I'm sorry, that's not how it works. Here's what it should have said. And sometimes it's just like, okay, so that's interesting. Yeah, we'll just let that be. But if it's an more open sort of question, I will try and answer it from a historical viewpoint and try and explain the logic behind what we were doing. There is a historical reason for just about everything in the rules. So yeah, I can give you a historical justification for just about everything as to why that rule is that way. And so that is the focus I tend to try and take when explaining things. But yeah.
So another thing, the last 20 years, and I tell this to young people coming into the games or anyone else on this, is that we're living in a fantastic age for wargaming, tabletop gaming, because the internet, self-publishing, Kickstarters, there is a way to use your existing figures in so many different ways. So I'll say, I have Battlefront, PvP, Command Decision figures that were the basis of the very large Flames of War, North Africa forces, etc. But I use them for O Group and I've used them for Rommel and everything else because they all play differently, and there's the opportunity to scratch a different itch with the same figures.
Yeah.
So is there a gaming community of designers where actually you sit down and compare notes, or you talk about the gamers and say, hey there, funny, what are the next things that we can do? Do you have a network like that now? Or?
No, not really. When I was over in the UK, my one and only visit to the UK, I did stop in at Nottingham and have dinner with some of the guys there, Stellard and I think Jarvis was there, and Alessio, and the Nottingham bunch, and spent an evening with them. But haven't really communicated much with them since. Sam Mustafa, Rommel, and Mike Hort here, and I sort of have a loose network together. But other than that, I'm very much more of a lone creature. I sort of do my thing, and yeah.
So in that regard, I suppose, did Flames of War change your life? And if so, what has it enabled you to do now?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. It would be hard to think it didn't change my life. I mean, had it not been successful, then my year sabbatical, which probably would have had to last at least 2 years before we actually published it, might not have lasted much longer than that, and I would have been back to doing database design or operations research or something else. Who knows what I'd be doing by now. But yeah, excuse me again. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've actually been mainly focused on board games. And that's been an interesting sideline. And over the last, or since the pandemic, I've wandered off and started writing, well, got more serious about writing a novel. And I'm looking this year to kickstart a World War II aerial game. And I've got a couple of other games. And so the opportunity of having an audience like you gentlemen who sort of know who I am has given me the opportunity to believe that I can kickstart a game of my own and have a fairly good chance of, even with a fairly expensive thing, of actually hitting it and making it work. So it's given me that opportunity. It has also made the writing a novel much more attractive. Your average novelist, when they start, have no audience and no particular idea where they're going to get an audience. Writing World War II historical fiction, I'm fairly sure that at least one of you gentlemen will probably buy it when it comes out. So multiply that across all of the gamers across the world, and I have a fairly good chance of actually getting somewhere with it, which is a much better start than most people. So the fame, as you might call it, does give me an audience for other projects that I want to do. And that is the most exciting outcome of it, being able to go, okay, so personally, I'd like to do this. And good news is a lot of people have heard of me. That means that when I put up my hand and say, hey guys, look at this, a lot of people will notice. And so that's the big thing.
Before everyone joined, you waved something around and we thought we could have a quick chat about it. Very iconic. It's lovely. So there's a few
Spitfire Mark I.
So there's a few aerial combat games, obviously, Blood Red, guys and others that go out. The club has done a bit of Wings of Glory in the past, and Check Your Six is played regularly at the moment. You're able to give us a sort of indication of how that's going to sit compared to the games that we're familiar with?
Yep. Of all of those ones you've mentioned, and just about every game out there, Check Your Six is, from memory, the only one that is not a direct descendant of Blue Max. Some of you may remember Blue Max from the 70s. Blue Max's basic mechanism is I pick a maneuver, you pick a maneuver, we reveal our maneuvers, and then it was a hex game, but then we move our aircraft and see where we end up. And that model is the same in Wings of Glory and just about every single game since. And it's a very, very weak model of aerial combat. So the thing that interests me, again, in the same thing, is that an aerial game must have a physics model in it. If it doesn't take into account physics, then it's not actually what I'm looking for. Now, a very sophisticated physics model and a lot of complexity and computation and so forth, and you might as well play a computer game. But where a tabletop game has an advantage over a computer game, or two advantages. One is you get a bunch of mates around a table and have some fun, which you can do on a computer, but it's just not the same as face-to-face. But the second one is tactics. Playing on a computer game and flying as a wingman in a finger four formation where the guy at the front is going to do almost all the shooting and everybody else is there just to keep them alive isn't that much fun for the other three players, and not that common. And there's a lot of issues with trying to do that sort of thing. So one of the two things I was looking for was, one, the ability to use proper physics, and two, the ability to fly multiple planes, which is something you can't do on a computer simulation. So once again, a lot of mathematics behind the scenes, but the result is that the aircraft actually fly properly. You have two pieces of information you carry across. Hang on. Between turns. One is your speed, and the other is your altitude. Good old-fashioned TV aerial cut-down thing. And if you know the speed and the altitude and the heading of an aircraft, you know pretty much the entire piece of information about it that's sort of relevant in a big picture. There are a lot more that's relevant if you want to get more detail, but that gives you enough to know what its energy is, its potential energy from its height, and its kinetic energy from its speed and its heading. So then the game has a very simple turn structure where, I mean, it's an I go, you go, classic Phil Yates. I really aren't into, though there's I'll disagree with myself in a moment there, but complicated turn sequences don't add to the playability of the game or its realism, in my opinion. So it is I go, you go. All the Allied planes fly, then all the German planes fly, or whatever. So each aircraft just goes through a single sequence of, it powers up. The amount of power it has depends on its climb rate, basically. So some aircraft are rockets. They just go whoop, and their speed, doesn't matter what you've just done, it's back at maximum because they're just powerhouses. Lake Messerschmitts are a good example of that. They have humongous engines and a tiny airframe. On the other hand, say a Mustang isn't really. It's a very, very big plane with a fairly good engine, but it does make it a little less grunty. Or the Fokker-Wulf is another one that's in the middle ground sort of thing. You've got to watch your energy with both of those, because if you get low and slow, it's going to be a wee while before you can get fast and high again. Whereas the Messerschmitt, it's like, no problem. Open the throttle. Right, we're back at full speed and keep going. And then you've got, there's no arc of fire or anything. If there's a target straight in front of you, shoot. Then you can roll, which is just a 45-degree turn, left or right. And again, it depends on the aircraft. Some aircraft, like the Focke-Wulf, just flick, we're turned. Others, like say a Hurricane or a Zero, it's like, hang on a moment, we'll roll in a moment, and yes, we finally got there. And then you can shoot again. So if you happen to be pointing at the target, you've just taken 2 shots at it. If it was in a 45-degree arc, you can take a shot at it. Then you climb or dive, burning energy as you do so, or gaining energy. Then you move whatever's left on your airspeed indicator, and then you can do a turn. And unlike the roll, which is only a 45, this can be as much as you like, and that's where your Zero and your Hurricane and so forth come in. They can do that part really well, whereas something like the Focke-Wulf is like, nah, won't really pull that one very hard, because although it's very nimble, it just doesn't have the wing area lift, blah, 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 to pull that. And then you get to shoot again. So if you're sitting right behind somebody's tail, you shoot, don't do anything, shoot, move forward, and shoot again. So very simple, but this, of course, you don't want to let somebody sit on your tail, and you, in your turn, your job is to make sure you end your turn without that being a possibility. Target is based on the direction of approach. So if you're behind them, basic hit on 3+. If you're ahead of them, 4+. If you've got a full deflection shot, 5+, plus range, plus altitude, blah, blah, blah. The other part of the game is situational awareness, and started off with more complicated stuff and just came down to, you get 2 maneuvers plus 3 dice. If you can roll your skill on any of those dice, you get an extra maneuver. So between 2 and 5 maneuvers. You roll badly, you're sitting there going, where the fuck did everybody go? You roll excellently, and you're going, I've got this, and pulling all the maneuvers. If you're an ace pilot, you're probably highly likely to be pulling 3 or 4 and maybe 5 maneuvers. If you're a greeny Russian pilot with 20 hours and you roll 3 6s, you can keep up with the ace, because this just happens to be your moment. For the rest of the game, you're going to be fluffing around with 2 actions, and you better hope that your mates are on the ball and just using sheer numbers to make sure that somebody is pointing at the target, rather than trying to get one aircraft pointing at the target. So that's the basic concept. It's got no hit points or anything. I loathe hit points. The game is basically, if you actually hit a target and get your firepower and save, then boom, it's gone. So very fast game. Idea is that if you are wanting to play for an afternoon, you just play a whole bunch of them, a whole bunch of games in a campaign. And everybody in aircraft games wants their pilot to get better and blah, blah, blah. So that works a lot better than, oh, yes, we're going to play for 2 hours while I busy sort of hammer the hit points off you sort of thing. So very fast, very deadly, a lot of fun. But it has a table at the end of the book that when you get shot down, you roll on a traditional D66 and see what happened to you. And the chance of you actually dying is really small, because if you compare claim rates with actual effect rates, it's very, very, very different. Even the air forces that had extremely good claiming, like the Germans, their claim rates were only about 2 to 1. They claimed only about twice as many as they actually shot down. They were extraordinarily good. In Manchuria with the Russians and the Japanese, the claim rates varied by day. Good day 20 times, average day about 30 times, on a bad day about 50 times. Yeah, so it's taking that into account. You got the kill. Everybody agrees that the target went down and disappeared. You get your little tick and you can put your kill mark up. On the other hand, the pilot might have had some interesting adventures, and you roll on this thing to find out what your adventures are. Sometimes you may have a penalty, like you're a bit freaked out for the next game, and so your morale's down, or you've got the jitters, so your skill's down. Or it might be a permanent penalty, or it might just be an interesting story. And in fact, if you roll a 6, you actually get a experience from it. you had an interesting trip home and learned something, or you thought very carefully on the way home about your experiences and you picked up some ideas of how not to have that happen again.
Sounds really interesting. And I like the way that you talked about the morale component, and it's not just a straight dice, because a lot of the games are thinking about the morale and the mindset of the people making the orders and decisions. So that sounds like a really good game. So I look forward to seeing what comes of that. And if you want some people to play test, then just let us know. There's one question that's just come on the chat. You said, is this scale agnostic, or are you looking for this for be miniatures based with a particular scale in mind?
I will be selling the, assuming everything comes right, I am talking with manufacturers at the moment, but it will be, you will get your box with, let's start to the paper, these with a 1/144 scale aircraft, little cockpit dials, the whole works, everything you need in the box. So you could make your own stands for bigger stuff and so forth if you wanted, but at 1/44 scale is partly it was because that's what Battlefront had, and that was made it easy to start with. But 1/200th on a vertically adjustable stand is just a bit small. 1/72nd occupies floor space as opposed to tabletop space. So it seemed like a good number, and that's the scale that we're looking at manufacturing.
Terrific. Well, look, Phil, this has been great. Pre-painted, okay.
Yep.
Well, which has got its own pros and cons depending on which side of the hobby you sit on.
Yep, you can always repaint them.
You can. Look, it's been great talking to you. We've hit an hour. We wanted to do that. So for the people who are on the call at the moment, if anyone wants to ask a question, now is your time to put it in chat, and better raise your hand so I can grab you. But whilst we're waiting to see if people want to ask a question, look, really appreciate you taking the time.
No problem.
It's exceeded my expectations from the stories and what you've been able to share with us. It was the name behind the game is exactly what this has been. You get to know more about you. It has been reminded that the question that really needed to be asked by someone was, what is happening to Operation Brevity? Are you ever going to bring that back?
Brevity. Okay. Right. Yep. That was the one I was working on that my wife said was boring before going on to Warhammer Panzer Battles. No. My interest is much more tactical. I am actually playing around with a tactical, like smaller scale than Flames of War tactical World War II game. But that's sort of still sitting in the development. But I did mention a non-IGO-UGO thing, and that's there where the game does have when you take an action with your troops, your opponent gets a chance to identify what you're doing. Again, an observation roll, basically. If they pass, you complete your action and they get the turn. If you manage to do 3 things without getting spotted, they get their turn anyway, just so it doesn't keep going. So you can do things like deep maneuvers out of sight, bringing up reserves and so forth without having to waste turn after turn, or get yourself into position. And then the whole thing is trying to match what I read in tactical, low-level tactical stuff, where the biggest problem is basically not being seen. Because when you get seen, you get shot at. When you get shot at, you cease to become effective. Not necessarily from any physical effects, just being shot at puts most people off, at least for a wee while. So the game is sort of aimed at being 1-to-1 at 100 scale, 1 centimeter to the meter, with either 1/100th or 28 mil figures. And having things like walking up the side of a hedge being much smarter than walking up across the middle of a field because you've got a backdrop. Really, really tactical stuff, but also hopefully without actually interfering with playability. So that's my personal World War II project. Yeah.
We've got one other question that's come in. Do you think a game based on Red Storm Rising is viable?
Okay, who asked that? And would you mind putting your mic on and clarifying, because I'm not quite sure what the question is.
Oh, that's actually me. It's based off your work with Team Yankee, and sort of curious as to see whether it'd be a large strategic level game in the works potentially.
Okay, as I said, I'm more of a tactical guy. I have done strategic-y stuff with, say, the Firestorm games and so forth. And yeah, it's fun and interesting, but it's not where I'm going to put my personal time. I'm much more interested in the smaller scale. Oh, and if I may, a advert, public service announcement, whatever. I did mention novel. Follow me on Phil Yates Author if you want to, on Facebook, Phil Yates Author. Unfortunately, I don't have a newsletter or anything yet. If you want to keep up with what's going on there, it's not going to spam you with lots of stuff. I haven't actually posted anything on there for a couple of months now, but first draft is finished and hopefully it will be out relatively soon. It's basically set in Greece in 1941 when the Second Anzac Corps tried to stop the German invasion and ended up getting kicked all the way to Crete. Yes, the second Gallipoli for the Anzacs. The British have another wonderful idea and are going to sacrifice the Anzacs to try and make it happen. So, as you'd expect from a book like this, it's following a young chap who arrives late so that he knows no more than you do and can have everything explained to him. But as you'd expect from a sharp or something, he's also at all of the interesting and critical junctures of the thing. Wherever there's somebody or something interesting happening, he's there. So you get the campaign from that viewpoint. It has a largest cast, everything from German Panzer Grenadiers and paratroopers through Yugoslavs and Greeks, and of course a bunch of New Zealanders. No Australians in this one, sorry. You'll have to wait to the second book in Crete for an Australian character. Yeah, the Australians' actions are there, but no actual Australians. Yeah, okay.
Can I nominate a Scottish lieutenant in the anti-aircraft battalion whose golf clubs got put on a ship, but he got left behind, so he was captured and the ship was sunk?
Who's that?
That was my grandfather.
Ah, and that was coming out of Greece or Crete? Sorry?
Greece.
Ah, so which port was he coming out of?
Find out if you want to know. But it's apart from there, but yeah.
Which battalion was he with?
I'll have to look at those things.
Oh, okay. Let me know. But, yeah. So yes, so it's the main character's adventures as he learns to sort of survive and take leadership. He, of course, goes in as an inexperienced lance corporal, taking over half a section and then a section while in action and learning to sort of do the things and keep his men alive. And at the start, of course, there's opposition and blah, 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 because he's joining an existing unit. And by the end of it, of course, as you'd expect from a story like this, he comes out sort of okay to get a nice bollocking from his boss for getting lost and missing the evacuation.
Does he meet Sir Charles?
Sorry?
Does he meet the future Sir Charles?
Upham. Charlie. Oh, yes. He arrives at Mount Olympus and gets a very colourful introduction to Upham. Plenty of words that the Americans won't like in that little exchange. But yes, he does meet Upham there. But in Greece, Upham's part was relatively minor. I mean, there wasn't much going on in Greece other than give the Germans a bloody nose, run away, give the Germans a bloody nose, run away, give the Germans a bloody nose, run away. It was a very disappointing campaign for pretty much everybody involved on the Allied side. So yeah, I'm hoping to do a trilogy, and that's the first book. The second one will be at Crete, where a little more experienced, the Anzacs are actually sort of doing it actually quite well, apart from the fact that it doesn't work. And then move to, unfortunately, the Aussies aren't in this part, into the Battle of Tobruk, Operation Crusader, where it's the victorious part where actually the New Zealand division sort of saves the day from fucking awful British generalship. The Aussies will come back again, of course, at Alamein, where their part was pretty spectacular. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of. You've got the Aussies have left Tobruk by the time of City of Rezeg. So unfortunately, they miss out there. But yeah, so that's the plan. So if you're at all interested in fictional World War II stuff, keep your nose or eyes peeled or ears open or whatever.
We'll chat afterwards. We'll get a link to the Facebook and I'll share it to the group. So
sounds good.
Well, look, Phil, thank you very much for your time this evening. It's been wonderful.
You're welcome.
Great to have you on board. I think it's been a very successful first name behind the game. Definitely had that. And hopefully in the future, maybe there'll be opportunity to explore some of the other things you're on and talk to a wider audience in the future.
That's good. Well, I hope you guys enjoy yourselves. I do recognize a couple of the faces from CanCons and Moabs and things, I think. So hi if I've seen you before. Meanwhile, enjoy yourselves.